Modern Linux is finally at a point where it is usable to do professional work, and it hasn't always been like this. For a long time, if you needed to do pro level work, you were relying on a lot of open source tools that could be kind of basic. I'm talking about you, GIMP. I know I'm GIMP's biggest hater. I should lay off. But the point is, for a long time, if you were using Linux, you were just a tinkerer. It wasn't that easy to do real world work on Linux unless you were a programmer. Programming on Linux has been better than Windows and Mac since as long as I've been using Linux for 10 years now. So with that, in this video, I just wanted to highlight some of the software that has finally made Linux a viable Windows and Mac OS replacement for me, because I literally use my Linux system for everything. Now, first off, I just want to start off with the Gnome desktop, specifically the Gnome workflow. So I am on my own Linux distro stillOS, so this isn't what a typical vanilla GNOME desktop would look like, but specifically the activities overview right here. This standalone feature is the reason why I use Gnome. KDE Plasma is a really good desktop environment too, but the overview in KDE Plasma just doesn't work the same as Gnome. So everything that you're able to do throughout the desktop is available from the overview. So I could go here and get a full screen view of all my applications, but I don't really do that because instead I just go to the overview and I just start typing. So let's just say now I'm on a blank desktop. I just got back from class and I want to start doing work on whatever school assignment I have. Well, I hit the Windows key on the keyboard and let's launch Notion, what I use for task tracking. Let's launch OnlyOffice for homework. Let's launch a browser so I can access the course material. The thing I love about the Gnome workflow is it's just so fast that just from hitting the super key, I could get to pretty much whatever program I need on my computer, as well as just switch between programs on my computer. And I can do that just as fast as I think. Additionally, you have the Gnome circle of apps. So this is a set of apps that all share human design guidelines, and basically they share a very similar graphical user interface. And so whenever I need just a basic utility, whether it's a calculator, a calendar, a document viewer, a music player, a video player, and even more niche tasks like a git commit editor, a translator, an audio tagger, a podcast player, there's just almost always a very high quality GNOME app that is going to be very easy to learn and pick up on and integrate with my system. All of these apps implement the GNOME human interface guidelines, which makes everything feel like a sort of coherent design system. And so with that, I actually think that the user experience on a modern GNOME desktop is actually a better user experience than the macOS and the Windows desktops. Yes, even the macOS desktop. Yet sometimes macOS has some weird clunky things like the way it does alt tab, the way maximizing windows works, things like that Gnome doesn't have. And so I just love using my Gnome desktop. Now, next up, I'm not a gamer, so this is probably the least important thing on this list for me personally, but Steam and Proton. So before Steam was on Linux, gaming on Linux wasn't really a thing at all, other than just a few one-off games and some open source games. Fast forward, and Valve becomes worried about Windows 8, so they want to start investing into Linux as an alternative platform just in case Windows completely goes to shit. And so they port Steam to Linux, and then they came out with the first Steam machines that didn't really go according to plan because they were restricted to Linux-only games, and at the time, Linux just didn't have the game support. So they invented Proton, which is a compatibility layer that allows you to almost perfectly run a lot of Windows games on Steam. And with that, they're able to actually build the Steam Deck. Now they're about to release the new Steam machine with what they learned from the first failure. And so all of this work that Valve has put into Linux gaming has completely changed Linux gaming. And if we go to ProtonDB right here, which is a site that tracks Linux game compatibility, 85% of games on here have a platinum or a gold rating, which means that generally these games will just work on Linux. And a lot of the time, with especially if enhancements coming out like NT-Sync, you can get even better performance on Linux than you would if you were to run the same game on Windows. And it's because of all of this that Linux is really starting to gain ground in terms of OS market share for gaming. If you look at the Gaming on Linux Steam market share tracker that basically takes the Steam hardware surveys and tracks Linux market share. Just 5 years ago, Linux was at 1% market share. And in the last 5 years, we've went from 1% all the way to the recent report, which is more than 5% of market share on Steam is now running Linux systems. And actually, if we go to English only, if we're only counting the English language, Linux is at 11% market share nowadays, which is crazy. With that, I would like to just give Valve a huge thank you for finally making Linux a viable platform for gaming. Yes, it still struggles with a lot of specifically anti-cheat driven games where if there's kernel level anti-cheat, it's just not going to work because the kernel level anti-cheat is just never going to work on a compatibility layer that needs the Windows kernel. But honestly, the way I look at it now is since I'm not a major gamer, I don't really have any favorite games that I play a lot. So whenever I do want to play a game sometime, I just see what's available on Linux and what sounds fun and just pick a game. With the current support, I have quite a few amount of options. Now, next up, I want to talk about OnlyOffice. Yes, LibreOffice has existed on Linux for a very long time now, but the thing that a lot of open source developers I don't think understand is that they need to reduce friction as much as possible to actually get people to use open source alternatives. And I'm having to install LibreOffice just for this video. But if we're using the default user interface on LibreOffice, it's just kind of clunky and ugly, and that turns a lot of new users away because they're going to open LibreOffice, and whether or not you like the ribbon bar in Microsoft Office, that is what people are used to, and this has sort of the older style of just having everything there as an icon, and so people are just thrown off by that look. Yes, LibreOffice does have a tabbed option, it's just not a default, and even then the tabbed option is just ugly because there's actually not like a differentiation between how the tabs look. It can be a little confusing just visually, and then just like your text style right here, it's cut off by default. It's just a very clunky user experience, and that turns people away when they're first starting, whether or not it works. And then another huge thing is that LibreOffice by default uses ODT, and while they do support DocX, the key differentiator to me about OnlyOffice is that, at least in America, I know Europe is trying to get off of American software and is trying to transition their governments to start using ODT, and they're encouraging companies too. But at least in America, whether you like it or not, people use Microsoft's DocX format, and OnlyOffice has better compatibility for a DocX file than LibreOffice is going to give you. And you get a user interface that is just a lot closer to Microsoft Office. So this is something that people can just seamlessly switch to without thinking about. They're not going to be confused by the UI. It's close enough to Office that it's just going to work for them. And then since you're natively using a docx file, when you need to share it with your client who is inevitably going to be using Microsoft Office, they're going to be able to open the document just fine. Now, I do think it's worth mentioning some of the web versions of Microsoft Office and Google Drive and things like that, because this is also another suitable alternative if you don't want to use OnlyOffice. And so if you need to do any collaboration with people using Microsoft Office, or you just want more guaranteed file support, this is a great stopgap or some sort of emergency where you do really need Microsoft Word for some reason, or another Microsoft app. As a matter of fact, I'm actually using a web app for the PowerPoint in this video. I'm using Zoho Show. And yes, I could be using like the OnlyOffice presentation tool or PowerPoint Online or Google Slides, but I'm just using the web version of Zoho just because I like how the slide templates look and I can create good looking slideshows for my videos just fast. But for a professional environment, any of those options work, and it's just a lot more easy to use and frictionless than it was back in the day when LibreOffice was pretty much the only option for a good office suite on Linux. Now, next up, we have Photopea, and this is going to be a Photoshop replacement for those switching to Linux. But GIMP just has a very clunky user interface, and some of the ways you have to do things in GIMP just require a bunch of extra steps that none of the other imaging programs have. I have a whole video about why GIMP isn't ready for the work that I do that you can watch. There's also Fog Panther, which is a brand new Photoshop type tool. You can even run Affinity on Linux using Wine, both of which I also have videos on. But for me, Photopea is just the best alternative to Photoshop. Now, it is a web app, and if you're using just the free version, you are going to get ads on a little sidebar. Now, my distro stillOS has some tools to make web applications integrate a little bit better into the system. So for me, because the system integration of web app is good enough for me on my own distro, and I built this system specifically for use cases just like Photopea and Office Online and everything. But the thing about Photopea is the user interface is nearly identical to Photoshop. So this is a similar situation to OnlyOffice where you aren't going to be getting user friction by having to relearn how the user interface works for the program. There's tools right here like just easy background removal, which I use for all my YouTube thumbnails. And I am paying the €5 a month, which is about $6 here, to remove ads from Photopea because I love it that much and I want to support the dev. But I'm not gonna lie, if I had to continue to use only GIMP on Linux, I would probably use a Mac just for Photoshop, because the amount of time I save with features like blending options in the layers, or smart objects where if I make the image small and resize it back to regular size, I'm not losing quality compared to the GIMP scale tool. All of these just allow me to efficiently do the work I have to do for YouTube thumbnails, for example, on a Linux system without loading up Photoshop on my Mac. Now, the next program I'm going to talk about is Davinci Resolve, which is a real Adobe Premiere alternative on Linux. So Davinci Resolve can do everything. It can do video editing, fusion graphics, color grading, audio work, and it's blowing up in the content creation space to the point where many people are switching from Premiere to Davinci Resolve on Windows and Mac OS because it's that good. And Davinci Resolve has a native Linux version, and so I don't have to use a Windows or a Mac computer for editing anymore. That said, Davinci Resolve for Linux has two caveats. One is that if you're on Linux, you probably want to spend $300 for the studio version, and that is because Windows and Mac OS have licenses for a lot of proprietary codecs that are built into the operating system, and so on an OS level, Davinci Resolve Free is able to use those proprietary codecs to allow a lot of video files to play out, whereas the free version on Linux, because Linux is open source, the operating system doesn't ship a lot of these codecs, and so the free version of Resolve cannot load most video files on Linux, so you will have to be busting out like video converters trying to get almost any video file working on the free version. The studio version, though, pays for a lot of these codecs, so if you're using the studio version on Linux, you're usually good. That said, I have paid for it, and I believe it's worth every penny because I'm making money now on YouTube, and I've already made more YouTube ad revenue than I've spent on Davinci Resolve Studio. And it's not a subscription, it's a one-time purchase. Now, the other Linux caveat is that Davinci Resolve only natively supports Red Hat Enterprise Linux for the distros that it targets. Now, there is a community project called Davinci Box, which uses DistroBox containers to allow you to easily install Davinci Resolve. Now, there is a community-made project called Davinci Box that allows you to make a container using DistroBox that can easily run Davinci Resolve, even if GPU pass-through. But you do have to do some stuff in the command line to get this working. Stay tuned, because I'm actually working on my own tool for Davinci Resolve that makes it easy to install, but also has a built-in converter where you can drag files into it and then instantly convert the file, and then drag the video file straight from the converter tool without going back into your file manager straight into Davinci Resolve. So stay tuned for that. But overall, Davinci Resolve on Linux is great once you get it working, and it allows me to do pro level video work on a Linux system. I'd also want to point out Kdenlive. This is a very, very good open source video editor. It isn't going to let you do professional level work the same way Davinci Resolve is, but if you're a beginner to making videos and you're just starting out, Kdenlive is going to give you more than enough to get started on video editing. So that's a great option too. This isn't like a situation like OnlyOffice or Photopea where the original open source alternative like GIMP or LibreOffice is just not enough for most people. LibreOffice is enough, but there's still just friction. Kdenlive, if you're doing basic video editing styles, including low-key the style I use for this channel, could be done on Kdenlive. I've just been using Resolve so long and I have all the shortcuts memorized that I continue to use it. But if you're like new to YouTube and you want a free option to get started, Kdenlive is a great tool. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is Bootc Atomic Update, aka bootable containers. So basically, instead of using a package manager for updating on my Linux system, I use a tool called Bootc, and some of the distros that this is available on is the Universal Blue project right here. They make all of these different Fedora-based distributions that use the Bootc Atomic Update system. And then my Linux distro, stillOS, is another distribution that uses this system. But basically, I don't have to worry about package manager conflicts anymore or things like that. I don't have to deal with any of that. I can just update my system. In fact, on stillOS, it's automatic, and I just know it's going to work. And it's doing that because it distributes the entire OS as just one giant image rather than a collection of packages. So upgrades are going to just work the same way it would on Windows, Mac OS. I wouldn't say just, it's probably more reliable than Windows, low key. The drawback is your file system is going to be read-only and you don't have access to a traditional package manager as easily, but you still have some control as you can use things like RPM OS tree to overlay drivers onto your system. You can use containers through DistroBox to run other distro packages on your system. And then for app installation, you would generally use Flatpak. And with that, I'm no longer living in the days of Linux where I used to be a heavy Arch user and I'd have to manually intervene on my system during some types of upgrades, and I'm not trying to do that anymore. I'm just trying to get my work done. Even like in Ubuntu, on every Ubuntu upgrade, all your PPAs get disabled. You have to deal with that. If you're upgrading from a Ubuntu LTS like a 2204 to a 2404, good luck with that without doing a reinstall. Bootc just eliminates a huge potential on Linux systems for things to go wrong. With all of that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Tell me what software for you has made Linux go from just a tinkering platform to something that you can actually use for the things that you do. I'm genuinely curious what people think about that. I'm getting pretty close to 10K, so please subscribe. Check out my Patreon if you want to help a broke college student out. And you may enjoy my video right here about why I don't think GIMP is ready in 2026. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.